Hi, I'm Amelia with the Ellenville Public Library and Museum, and welcome today to today's Mindful Relationships program with our wonderful presenter, Courtney Edwards.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be back and offering up this topic. We're going to talk about the ways that we can be more mindful in our relationships. And so part of that will be focusing on traditional practices of meditation and mindfulness in that sense, although the entire program is not based on that. And you can still incorporate a lot of these tips and a lot of this information into your life, even if you're not a practitioner of meditation, because really what we're talking about is paying attention and being aware of what's happening in the moment that it's happening. So those are kind of universal rules. And we're going to talk about how meditation practice can help build that, but it's not exclusive to that. You don't have to be a meditator to be mindful in your relationships. And so I wanted to start with a quote that would kind of provide a good starting point. And this one from Cheryl Strayed's book, Tiny Beautiful Things, stood out to me as kind of appropriate for this presentation. And she writes, "The story of human intimacy is one of constantly allowing ourselves to see those we love most deeply in a new, more fractured light. Look hard, risk that." And this spoke to me because of a couple different parts. One is mindfulness practice really calls for us to be present, and this idea of constantly allowing ourselves to see those we love made me think of that presence. You know, in order to be with somebody, for them to feel seen, you need to be with them and you need to see them. And so there was a reciprocity and a present moment awareness in that quote that really stood out to me. And then to talk about that new, more fractured light. So mindfulness practice also invites us to recognize things as they are and to accept them as they are, even when they are imperfect, to allow space for that and to move away from coulds and woulds and shoulds and supposed tos, and really just embrace what's in front of us as it exists. And so that new, more fractured light, I think, also speaks to, allowing the people with whom we're in relationship to exist as they are, to recognize that they're imperfect, that situations are imperfect, that none of us are always going to be getting it perfectly right all the time, and that that's okay, and that there's some beauty in that too. And as I mentioned really briefly, but I will reiterate again, there will be time at the end of the formal part of the presentation to ask questions or to talk about ways that you can maybe work on relationships in your life. So if you feel something come up for you, by all means, take a little note of it, and we'll provide some space for that at the end, and that part will not be recorded. Before we go too far deeply into our program, I should probably take a moment to introduce myself. I am Courtney Edwards. I have a behavioral health coaching practice, and a meditation program called So La Vie Holistic. So I work with individuals and small groups at working on some mental wellness and mental well-being issues through mindfulness and self-care. And I also teach at SUNY New Paltz. So I teach in the counseling program there. So that's who I am. The other, before we start, note that I really wanted to make, and I felt it was important to make, was that everything that we're going to talk about here is coming from a place of recognizing that these tips and techniques and approaches really only work in safe and healthy relationships. If somebody is being maltreated, if they're being abused, there's no amount of mindful communication that somebody can bring into a relationship that will get their abuser to stop abusing them. So I don't think that these ideas are relevant to anybody who is in a relationship that is non-consensual or is not safe. And so today we're talking specifically about emotionally healthy, safe mutually consenting, and reciprocal relationships. We're also talking about all types of relationships. So when we came up with this idea, we centered it around Valentine's Day, thinking that that's often a intense time for a lot of couples. Maybe it makes you reflect on your own relationship, and maybe you're identifying that there's some things you want to work on. But all of these ideas, this idea of being present with the people with whom you're communicating, engaging in emotional intelligence, using mindful communication techniques, those are applicable in all types of relationships and friendships and families and workplaces. So this is not exclusive content to romantic relationships, although that will largely be the framework that we'll be talking about. So being mindful in relationships, there's three major things that we're going to spend some time talking about today. One is, as I mentioned, using meditation and mindfulness practice to be more present in the moment of your relationships, really being with the people that you're with when you're with them. Utilizing mindful awareness to increase your own emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is the ability to identify, recognize, name, use, manage, and respond to emotions appropriately, both your own and with somebody else. And so we're going to talk about how we can use that awareness, that paying attention, to learn more about our own emotional states, how we experience them, how we respond to them, and how to more effectively be with somebody else as they're experiencing an emotion. And then finally, we'll be kind of combining those two things and talking about how to utilize mindful presence and awareness to communicate more effectively, to bring compassion and empathy into our communication patterns, to be able to say what we need to say and hear what the other person is trying to say to us in return. So, mindful presence, being with the person you're with when you're with them. We live in a society that is, in many ways, one giant experience of overstimulation after another. So, we've got TVs, we've got devices in our hands, they ping at us for everything, whether or not we're moving enough, our heart rate is where it should be. People are constantly communicating with us. We're getting notifications from our social media. The lines, particularly in COVID, between work and home are blurred in ways that they maybe haven't been for a lot of people previously. And so learning how to disengage from the world around us when we're experiencing a moment with another person, it may seem really obvious, but it can also be really difficult to achieve. And it's not necessarily that anybody's doing anything wrong. I think a lot of it just is driven by this kind of fast-paced, very kind of stimulated environment that we find ourselves in. But one of the ways that we can really be better partners, and better friends, better family members, is by learning to create space to be with the person that we're with when we're with them. So I use meditation as a starting point to learn this skill. And I try to really kind of be clear in meditation and mindfulness are often used synonymously, but they're not always synonyms. And the way that I teach meditation is that by practicing a seated meditation, you learn to be more mindful in your life. So, meditation is a thing that we do to hone a skill, and that skill is what we incorporate when we're talking about mindful living. So, meditation helps us become more present. It helps us become still in a world that does not always value stillness. It helps us recognize different experiences in our bodies, so we can begin to recognize where we experience emotion in our body. We can also use a seated meditation practice to learn to sit with discomfort. One of the things that can be really tricky in relationships is they get uncomfortable, they get difficult, and we don't know if we can tolerate that. Again, our society is very driven towards feel good and positive feedback and positive reinforcement. And sometimes relationships are really difficult. Conversations can be really difficult. And can you learn to build your tolerance to sit in that discomfort when there is something that needs to be dealt with? And meditation can actually teach that. One of the examples that I frequently will give is, if you are seated in a meditation practice and your nose starts to itch, or if you get an itch on your back or on your hand, can you sit with it without scratching it? And that seems a little bit like, why would you do that? But it can be a really powerful tool in training your thought process of, yes, this is happening, and I don't need to immediately respond to it. And that is how then you can build presence, because you can stay with your breath. You can stay in that practice. You can stay in that moment without necessarily feeling like you have to react, because we live in a world that is so very reactionary. And then through that practice, you take that off. We call it taking it off your cushion. So you take that practice off your cushion, and you integrate it into your everyday life. So now when your phone is pinging, but you're in conversation with somebody you care about, can you not respond to the phone? Can you let it go? Can you put it maybe in another room and just really give your full attention to the person that you're with? And by being more present in that moment, you're actually giving of yourself to this person, that you may care about to varying degrees. So it allows us to be in the moment. And meditation and mindfulness also allow us to be in the body. And so I talk a lot about where we find emotions in our body. So when you are feeling distress, if you're feeling anxiety, if you're feeling sadness, can you identify where that shows up for you in a physical sense so that you can be aware that you're experiencing it? That's kind of like that first step of emotional intelligence, is being able to recognize, like, oh, I have this tightness in my chest, and I know that that's anxiety, so I'm feeling nervous about something right now. And you check in with yourself. What is it? What is making me feel nervous? Maybe you're having a conversation, and the person you're talking with says something and you feel yourself tense up. By being present in your body, you're actually going to notice that tensing sooner, right? So now you have an opportunity to say, oh, something's happening here. I'm feeling stress. I'm feeling defended. I'm feeling anxious. What is that? Think about it. Now you can respond in an appropriate way, as opposed to maybe lashing out or shutting down, or some of the ways that we often will react when things have gotten to a certain intensity, or we're just really kind of feeling like the conversation went off the rails a little bit. So, by being present in the moment, we're able to actually be connected with the other person. We're able to give them the gift of our full attention, and really be engaged with them, and not kind of, also checking Facebook and thinking about emails you need to send and running through your life to do list, but actually be with the person. And you can recognize better what is happening in that moment, both the thoughts that you're having about a situation, or the emotional response that you might be having, from one moment to the next. So then we move into this idea of mindful awareness. And specific to this conversation, we're talking about emotional awareness. So, again, this idea of being able to recognize emotions because you can sense them in your body, because you can feel them, like physically experience them, that you are able to distinguish between the nuance of emotions, right? So we kind of think about, sadness, and sad, angry. I'm thinking about the movie Inside Out, right? So we've got like sadness, we've got joy, we've got disgust, we've got fear. But you can really kind of start to flesh those out a little bit more, to really distinct, nuanced emotional states. And the more that you're paying attention, in the moment, to what you're feeling, what the various triggers were, what your thought processes are around those emotions. That's how you can start to really be able to tell the difference between an anger that's resulting from feeling threatened versus an anger that is coming because you feel violated in some way. So that you can start to really understand the motivations behind those emotional states, which then gives you an opportunity to respond differently, right? And you can also start to become aware of the feelings that you're feeling, whether they're coming from a story that you're telling yourself, right? And so, what I mean by that is when we interpret through our past experiences, through our old wounds, through unresolved struggles that we've dealt with, we create stories about things that are happening, right? And so say you're in a conversation and your partner makes a comment that you take as an insult, you can now start to kind of explore that through mindful awareness. Did this person insult me? Maybe they did, right? And then that would be the response. But maybe it's tied to a story that you're telling yourself. Maybe it was the way that you interpreted that. And through this mindful awareness, you learn to decipher that. You can start to really become more adept at understanding this is a story that I'm telling myself, or this is a real legitimate concern. And then you respond to those in the appropriate way. And that's not to suggest that sometimes people don't do things wrong. They certainly do. But we also sometimes kind of craft these little narratives, and then we filter everything that we experience through them. And so by being mindfully aware, it helps us start to learn the difference a little bit. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about today, specific to emotions, and this relates to recognizing them in our bodies, is I think that we have a tendency to want to feel good, right? We live in a society that promotes feeling good, that rewards feeling good, and so we tend to get into a very judgmental stance about our emotional states. So to feel happy is good, to feel sad is bad, right? And we put them on very opposite ends of the spectrum. And that causes us to start to judge our own emotional experiences. And it causes us to cling to good emotions while we subsequently try to push away, deflect, or avoid bad emotions. So, if a conversation gets really difficult, we might shut down. We might turn away from our partner. We might stop communicating. We might get really guarded and start to deflect or use sarcasm or become hostile ourselves because we've got this again the story that we've been telling ourselves that's reinforced by society that to feel discomfort is bad, to feel angry is bad, to feel sad is bad. And so then we try to avoid those negative feelings. So, one of the ways that I often talk about feelings is either through energy or kind of this like tone of them. So it helps to diffuse this good versus bad way of approaching it. So thinking about the energetic nature of feelings, you can have kind of what really high energy feelings. And those can be things like fear, right? Fear can be a big, energetic, hot kind of feeling energy in your body, right? There's a lot of vibration to that when you experience it in your body. But so is excitement, right? Maybe you're about to go on a trip and you're feeling that same energy. Those energy states are very, very similar, even though one is traditionally a good thing that we should enjoy, and one is traditionally considered a bad thing that we should avoid. And then on the flip side, being at peace, being content, being really glad or really happy in a moment, that can be a calmer, a cooler, energetic experience. It can maybe feel like a smaller feeling, but so can loneliness, and so can sadness, and so can grief in some cases. And so starting to maybe think about emotional states in that way and not, I want to feel good, I don't want to feel bad, but just recognizing emotions is energy. And sometimes you're going to have big energy and it's going to feel, there's going to be some heat to that energy and it's going to take up a lot of space. And then sometimes your feelings are just going to be a little bit quieter. They're going to be cooler. They're maybe not going to take up so much space. And that they both carry traits of kind of positive and negative as a way that we have more traditionally thought about them. And one of the things that I find helpful about approaching emotions that way is it diffuses that kind of clinging and that avoiding, because now it's not so much about a yes or no dichotomy. It's more just, this is what I'm feeling in this moment. Right now, I'm feeling the heat of anger in this moment, or right now it's very quiet and I notice that I'm sad. And you can now work with that and you can respond in a way that maybe is a little bit more appropriate to the moment, or maybe just feels better to you, instead of having kind of this, again, this kind of reactionary knee jerk response. You can be very thoughtful about the way that you wanted to respond. And I do have a quick little 5-question checklist that I was going to share today. And if you have a little place to jot things down, otherwise we just want to keep track of how many A, B's, or C's you get. It's not very complicated. But this is a nice little touchstone to just kind of consider where you are in your own emotional intelligence development, and if it's something that maybe you want to address and think about and work on outside of this workshop. Emotional intelligence in and of itself could be an entire workshop. So we're just going to keep it real quick, but this might just give you something to think about. If some things come up for you when you hear these questions and that maybe you want to consider after the workshop, something that you might want to address for yourself. So the first question is, what do you do when you are under stress? A, I tend to deal with it calmly and rationally. B, I get upset, but it usually blows over quickly. Or C, I get upset, but I keep it to myself. And again, you just kind of want to keep track of your A, B's, and C's. That's all we're going to think about when this is over. Number 2, my friends would say that A, I play, but only after I get my work done. B, I'm ready for fun anytime. Or C, I hardly ever go out. Number 3, when something changes at the last minute, A, I adapt easily. B, I get frustrated. C, I don't care because I don't really expect things to happen according to plan. Number 4, I am sensitive. My friends would say, I forgot to read the question. Number 4, my friends would say, A, I am sensitive to their concerns. B, I spend too much time worrying about other people's needs. Or C, I don't like to deal with other people's petty problems. And the last one, when I have a problem to solve, such as having too many assignments due at the end of the week, I write down a list of the tasks I must complete, come up with a plan indicating specifically what I can accomplish and what I cannot, and follow my plan. B, I am very optimistic about getting things done and just dig right in and get to work. Or C, I get a little overwhelmed. Usually I get a number of things done and then push aside the things I can't do. And so, thinking about your responses, if you found that you had mostly A responses, then that's an indicator that your emotional intelligence is probably pretty strong. If you had mostly B responses, it means that there are areas of strength, but maybe a couple things that you could address to build that skill a little bit more. And if you had mostly C responses, then that's a good indicator that your work or your relationships might be negatively impacted, and that emotional intelligence is an area that you might want to think more about, either on your own or by connecting with somebody that could support you with that. So hopefully that exercise just gives you a little bit of just a little bit of personal insight, if that's something that's important to you. And that brings us to mindful communication. And I say here in the slide, sharing, listening, and hearing. So when we're sharing, I think a lot of times when we talk about communication, we talk a lot about you should hear what your partner is saying, should really be engaged and listening and hear their message. But it's also important to remember that communication is a two-way street. And we, as the communicator, also have a responsibility to say what needs to be said, to use mindfulness, to use awareness, to speak from a place of empathy and compassion, but to make our voices heard. And I think that that can be really challenging for a lot of folks because it requires a high level of vulnerability. And we're not, as a society, very good with vulnerability. It's really hard sometimes to let people truly see you, and to let people in. And you want to protect those parts of yourselves that you think are imperfect. But that also then keeps people out, and it really inhibits close connection. It inhibits our ability to say what we need to say and to hear what the other person is saying. So as much as you're able to, work on that vulnerability muscle, that will also be something that will propel your relationships forward, including your relationship with yourself, because there's a lot of self-compassion tied in with allowing yourself to be vulnerable. So kind of building off the things that we already talked about, when we are more present with our partners, when we are more present in the moment, and when we have learned to eliminate distractions, not respond to the distractions in our life immediately, that gives us an opportunity to really hear, really listen and hear to what our partners are trying to tell us, and to be able to respond to it. By using awareness, particularly emotional awareness, we can be more in tune with what's coming up for us as we're hearing those things. What are the feelings that we're experiencing? And we can learn to recognize the emotional experiences of our partner, the other people that we're communicating with. It helps us then respond from a place of compassion and from empathy. If somebody responds to you or says something to you in a way, and you don't know where it's coming from, you are then forced to interpret if their intention was good, if their intention was hurtful. But by being more in tune with somebody's emotional state, it's going to help actually provide some of that information for you. And you can know, is this person maybe just in pain, right? And so question that I frequently ask myself when I think people are behaving in a way that I wish they weren't behaving, instead of kind of being like, what's wrong with that guy? To ask yourself, what happened to them? What happened to that person? Because I think so often what we kind of consider acting out is really just somebody is in pain. And so using awareness to recognize those things, to recognize the emotional states of other people, to recognize our own emotional states, can help us be more empathic. And it can help us respond with compassion and with love if it's people that we love. And we can be in a moment of disagreement and not lose all of those other things, not stop caring about the person, not stop feeling compassion for them, not stop feeling empathy for them, because we're able to kind of sort through the truth of the matter outside of the emotional states that may in their own way be distracting. The other thing that's really important in mindful communication, and this is again one of those sort of universal communication rules that can be really helpful, is speaking from your own perspective. So in conflict mediation or in counseling, we call those I messages. But really what that comes down to is saying what your experience is. So an example, your partner comes home and they didn't do the laundry like they said they would, right? And it's really kind of a natural thing to be like, you didn't do the laundry. You didn't do this thing that you said you would do, right? And there's a lot of accusation to that, and that can then cause a defensive reaction, and now you're fighting, right? Where as opposed to if you can say, I had a really hard day and I was depending on you to do the thing that you said you would do, and I feel frustrated when you don't do that. It helps inform your partner of kind of what really the issue is, and it diffuses a lot of that accusatory tone. You're not just kind of throwing, you didn't do, or you always do, or you did this. You're not throwing that at your partner now. You're taking responsibility for the way that you feel, and you're expressing that in a way that is, quite neutral. And there is a truth that's hard to dispute, right? It's so somebody could, you didn't do the laundry. Well, I didn't have time, right? As opposed to, I felt really frustrated. You can't necessarily argue that quite as much because you're owning that and that's your truth. And so it helps get away from like, now you're parsing apart words and trying to find loopholes in an argument to get out of trouble, because it's taking away that accusation or that implication of your being in trouble. And it's also putting the focus on the conversation about what has transpired between the two people, right? Because oftentimes when we get into conflict with our partners, the thing that we're arguing about is not always the thing that we're arguing about, right? So we're not necessarily arguing about laundry. What we might be arguing about is a feeling of overwhelm or a distrust in being able to rely on one another. Those are bigger issues, right? But it's very easy to yell at each other about whether or not the laundry's done or the dishes are done or the dog got taken out for a walk, right? So just kind of keeping that in mind. And again, those are rules that are kind of universal, and can be utilized in a wide variety of different ways. Another thing that I like about using iMessages, and one of the ways that I work with couples when I've done couples therapy, is to work from what we call a solutions focused perspective. And so, what that does is it shifts the focus of the conversation onto how to solve the problem instead of the problem itself. So, using the example that we were just using, you have a couple, the laundry didn't get done. They can fight about that laundry, or they can say from an I statement, I felt, unsupported in this moment. I'm really struggling with my own responsibilities. I had been depending on you to help me out with some housework. And now you can come to a place of collaboration of how can we solve this? What is the thing that we can do that will make this okay for both of us? And now that opens up a place of partnership and collaboration and communication instead of you versus me or partner versus partner. It starts to create a space of it's us against this problem, and we're going to work together to solve it. Right. And so that shift can really open up communication in some pretty meaningful ways, because it really does help diffuse a lot of, that antagonistic conflict that often will start to muddy the waters of what you're really trying to say, what you're really trying to get across to one another. And so those are some really helpful tools in learning how to communicate more effectively. So when we put all of this together, some of the things that we can now start to do more effectively, we can recognize emotions in ourselves and others. We can be more thoughtful in our responses to those emotions, both the way we're responding to our own emotional states, the way we're responding to somebody else's emotional state. We can utilize strategies for staying calm. So, by recognizing where emotions live in your body, you can now respond to them thoughtfully. And if you're using meditation as one of those techniques, you can get in touch with your breath. You can work on some grounding exercises. You can just become aware of that emotional state and send some breath and some love and some light to, maybe you're feeling it in your shoulders, you're all tense, right? I always say my identity, the animal I identify with is the armadillo, because when I'm in crisis, I want to like curl up and put my little shell on. And now that I can feel that, I notice that in my body. And so I can actually work to like send a little breath and a little love and a little light into my shoulders and open them up, drop them down, get them out of my ears, right? So it can be calm. And by working with the breath and working to calm your emotional states in your body, then you can also, change the way that you're responding, because everything gets sort of de-escalated and you can be more in control. All of this also allows space for increased vulnerability, and you can arrive more authentically in your relationships as yourself. And you can be more empathic and more compassionate towards the people that you are in relationship with, whether it's friends, partners, family members, coworkers. You can respond to them from a place of empathy and showing them some compassion. So I want to take some time for questions. I am going to stop the recording here so that people can feel inclined questions and to engage in the conversation that way. So thank you for sharing those. So
Thank you. Thank you so much.
yeah, anytime. If you are interested, I'm all over the social media. Is what I do. You can find me. My handle is pretty much consistent across platforms at So Love You Holistic. And as I mentioned, I do lunch and learns, I do small group workshops, I do group coaching, individual coaching. And so there's all my contact information. You can reach out if there are specific questions that you have about this content or any other concerns you might have. You can certainly reach out at any time. But that is all I have for today.